In the iron-hard winter of 1886, on the endless wind-scoured plains of the Dakota Territory, a silence fell. It was the silence of 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold so absolute it snapped timber, turned kerosene to jelly, and froze cattle where they stood. For homesteaders like Elias Thorne, his magnificent timber-frame Ohio-style barn, a 60-foot monument to prosperity, had become an icebox tomb for his herd. His cattle, backs coated in frost, huddled against plank walls that offered no more protection than paper, their desperate breathing hanging in the air like smoke. He was losing 2, sometimes 3 a day. 20 miles west, in a shallow coulee invisible from the prairie floor, Arne Hansen's 40 head of shorthorn were, by contrast, placid. They were restless, perhaps, but they were alive, steaming gently in the humid half-light. They were not in a barn. They were underground. Hansen, a quiet Norwegian with a different understanding of physics, had hidden his entire herd inside the earth. What did this immigrant homesteader, dismissed by his neighbors as the Dakota gopher, understand about thermodynamics that seasoned American ranchers, with their thick timber frames and deep pockets, had missed entirely? The Dakota Territory in the 1880s was a land of brutal truths and expensive lies. It was sold to a generation of settlers, many fresh from Europe or the greener fields of the East, as a new Eden. Railroad pamphlets distributed in cities from Boston to Berlin spoke of rich, black soil and invigorating, dry cold. They showed engravings of sprawling farms centered on magnificent timber frame barns, symbols of status and permanence borrowed directly from the rolling hills of Pennsylvania or the mild valleys of Ohio. This was the conventional wisdom. To succeed on the prairie, one must build big, build fast, and build with wood. The manuals provided by the Northern Pacific Railway detailed the American system of farming, which prioritized above-ground structures. A proper barn, the experts insisted, must be tall to cure hay in a spacious loft, and it must have good ventilation, which was often misinterpreted as meaning drafty, single-plank walls. The prevailing belief was that brute force and visible structure were the only way to tame the landscape. Settlers like Elias Thorne took this gospel to heart. He had spent $450, a small fortune, to import milled pine and hire a crew to erect his barn. It was his proof of concept, a declaration that he had mastered the prairie. He, like his neighbors, trusted the book. They trusted the visible, the imported, and the expensive. Elias Thorne's barn was, by the standards of the day, a masterpiece. It measured 60 feet in length, 40 feet in width, with a gambrel roof rising to a height of 30 feet. Its foundation was cut stone, and its frame was heavy 8-inch oak, shipped at great expense. But its weakness was its skin. The walls were single-layer 1-10-inch pine planks, vertically applied. The theory was that as snow piled against it, the barn would seal itself. The reality was the opposite. The wind in Dakota does not just blow, it drills. It found every microscopic gap, every warped board, every joint between plank and frame. It was a perfect convective engine, designed to steal heat. In the first blizzard of December 1886, the temperature inside Thorne's barn, measured by his new mercury thermometer, dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, only 20 degrees warmer than the outside air. The wind drove fine, pulverized snow through the planking, creating drifts inside the stalls. His cattle, 80 head of fine Hereford stock, began to burn their own mass just to stay alive. They stopped eating, their stomachs shrinking from the cold. Thorne had to post 2 hired men in the barn 24 hours a day, armed with clubs, simply to force the cattle to get up. Any animal that lay down for too long would freeze to the urine-soaked floor and never rise again. His fuel consumption was catastrophic. He was burning through his seasoned wood pile just to heat his house, and had resorted to burning precious hay, the cattle's winter feed, in a dangerous open brazier in the barn's center aisle, risking catastrophic fire just to raise the ambient temperature by 5 degrees. By the first week of January, he had already lost 12 head. The barn was not a shelter. It was a beautifully constructed $450 refrigeration unit. Arne Hansen had not read the railroad pamphlets, His knowledge came from a different, colder source. He was born in Telemark, Norway, on a mountain farm, or cedar, where the growing season was 100 days and the winter was 8 months. He had never seen a large, uninsulated timber barn in his life. In his homeland, survival was not based on fighting the elements, but on avoiding them. He had grown up in a house banked with earth, and his family's livestock wintered in a jordkjeller, an earth cellar dug into the hillside, or a stone barn built with 4-foot-thick walls. He understood a principle that Elias Thorne did not. The air is your enemy. The earth is your friend. He had watched his grandfather bury potatoes in the fall and retrieve them, crisp and unfrozen, in the spring, protected by 3 feet of sod. He knew that snow, the very thing his neighbors cursed, was the finest insulation God provided, second only to the earth itself. When Arne arrived in Dakota and saw the vast, treeless expanse, he did not see a place to build up. He saw a place to dig down. His neighbors, including Thorne, watched him spend his first summer not felling cottonwood, but moving dirt with a horse-drawn slip scraper. They called him Gopher Hansen and the Norwegian Badger, mocking his seemingly lazy, primitive approach. He ignored them, secure in a knowledge thousands of years old. Arne selected his site with care. A south-facing slope in a dry coulee, sheltered from the prevailing north and west winds. He did not build a structure. He excavated one. For 3 months, from May to August, he and his 2 teenage sons worked from dawn until dusk. Using the slip scraper, plow horses, and hand shovels, they carved a massive trench into the hillside. The final structure was 80 feet long and 24 feet wide. The back wall was 14 feet high, cut deep into the hill. The roof was not shingles, but a massive, layered system. First, he laid heavy cottonwood beams, salvaged from the river bottom. Across these, he laid a solid deck of 3-inch thick planks. On top of the planks, he layered 18 inches of prairie hay for its insulating air pockets, followed by a full 3 feet of the packed clay and sod he had originally excavated. This roof was not just a cover. It was a thermal mass, nearly 5 feet thick. The only part of the barn exposed to the air was the south-facing front wall. This he built of thick fieldstone masonry, 2 feet thick, with 2 heavy insulated plank doors and 4 small deep-set windows to capture the low winter sun. The entire project cost him $42, mostly for the glass panes, hinges, and blasting powder for the densest clay. It took 500 hours of his own labor. To his neighbors it looked like a root cellar, a primitive burrow. It looked, to their eyes, like failure. The conflict between Arne Hansen and Elias Thorne was not one of personalities, but of physics. It was a battle between 2 opposing philosophies of survival. Thorne's barn represented the brute force method. It was a philosophy of confrontation. It sought to stand tall, to face the wind, to impose an Eastern ideal of structure onto a landscape that rejected it. Its performance was entirely dependent on its R value, the ability of its thin 1-inch pine walls, an R value of barely R1, to resist the conduction of heat. In the face of 40-mile-per-hour winds, which maximized convection, heat loss through air movement, the R1 wall was meaningless. The system failed because the heat generated by the cattle was stolen by the wind faster than they could produce it. Arne Hansen's cave was a philosophy of avoidance and efficiency. It was not about R value. It was about thermal mass and the elimination of infiltration. The earth itself, once you get below the frost line, which could be 6 feet deep in Dakota, maintains a stable, constant temperature. The ground 12 feet down was not warm, but it was a consistent 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Hansen's barn wasn't being heated by the earth. It was simply not losing heat to the 50-degree air. The only exposed surface, the south-facing wall, was R14 stone. The roof, 5 feet of sod, hay, and earth, had an R value exceeding R40. The cattle, each a 1,000-pound animal, were biological furnaces, each producing roughly 3,000 BTUs per hour. In Thorne's barn, this heat vanished. In Hansen's cave, it was trapped. The 40 head of cattle were all the furnace he needed. In early January, Dr. Silas Weir, a veterinarian contracted by the territorial government to assess the catastrophic livestock losses, made his way to Thorne's farm. He was a man of science, grim and pragmatic, his notebook filled with grim statistics. He found Thorne in a state of siege. Weir entered the massive barn, and his thermometer, after 15 minutes, registered 18 degrees Fahrenheit near the door and a tepid 4 degrees in the center. Despite the choking smoke from the hay brazier, the air was thick with the smell of frost, ammonia, and impending death. He noted 3 animals down, frozen solid. He recorded Thorne's feed consumption, a disastrous burn rate, and his 15% herd loss to date. Shaking his head, Weir proceeded to Hansen's property, following rumors of the Gopher Man. He found the coulee, the mound of earth, and the 2 stone doors. He knocked. Arne Hansen opened the door, and Dr. Weir was hit not by a wave of cold, but by a wall of warm, humid, animal-smelling air. He stepped inside. The only light came from the 4 small windows and 2 kerosene lanterns, but it was enough. The 40 cattle were arranged in 2 long rows, steaming gently, their coats damp, not with frost, but with humidity. They were alert, chewing their cud. Dr. Weir unbuttoned his heavy coat. He placed his thermometer on a beam in the center of the cavern. He and Hansen spoke for 20 minutes, the veterinarian asking quiet, pointed questions about ventilation and feed. When he checked the thermometer, it read 39 degrees Fahrenheit. It was 90 degrees warmer than the outside air. Hansen reported he was feeding standard rations, as the animals were burning no extra calories for warmth. His herd loss, 0. Hansen's system was not just a whole. It was a precisely engineered environment. Its success depended on 3 factors, the most crucial of which was ventilation. This was the trick that made it work. The problem with 40 large animals in a sealed underground space is not just cold, but moisture and air quality. The respiration from 40 cattle releases over 50 gallons of water vapor into the air every day, along with ammonia from their waste. Without ventilation, the air would become toxic, and the animals would contract lung fever, pneumonia, and die. Hansen had engineered a passive stack effect system. At the front of the cave, near the doors, 2 8-inch diameter wooden pipes ran down the stone wall to the floor, providing a steady, controlled intake of fresh, cold, heavy air. At the back of the cave, at the deepest and highest point, he had built a 2-foot square wooden flue that extended 10 feet up through the sod roof and into the open air, complete with a small rotating cap to protect it from downdrafts. The warm, moist, ammonia-laden air, being lighter, would rise, travel along the sloped ceiling, and exhaust naturally through this chimney, pulling in fresh, cold air from the front intakes. This slow, constant circulation kept the air quality high and the humidity manageable, all without a single moving part or external energy source. The second factor was the thermal mass itself. The earth walls and floor acted as a massive heat sink, absorbing the animal's body heat and radiating it back, stabilizing the temperature. The third factor was the insulated super roof, which prevented any of this trapped heat from escaping. The climax came in mid-January, with a weather event that would enter legend, the Great Cold. For 72 hours, the territory was held in a grip of impossible cold. The official temperature at the signal station in Bismarck, 100 miles away, registered 51 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled at a steady 30 miles per hour, creating wind chills that were simply off the charts, estimated at 100 or lower. This was not weather. It was an extinction-level event. At the Thorne farm, the fight was over. The hired men abandoned the barn, retreating to the main house, burning furniture to keep the stove going. Thorne, in a final act of desperation, had tried to lead his 10 surviving cattle into his house, but they were too weak to move. His $450 barn was a tomb of ice-encrusted statues. The sound of the wind was indistinguishable from the popping and snapping of the green timber frame as it super-froze. At Hansen's cave, the 10-foot drifts of snow that buried his roof and front entrance were not a curse, but a final, perfect layer of insulation. The only sign of life was the thin plume of steam exiting the ventilation flue. The system was stressed to its limit. The 51-degree air coming down the intake pipes was so cold it created frost on the floor. But the thermal mass of the Earth and the combined body heat of 40 animals held the line. The interior temperature, Dr. Weir, who was now stranded with the Hansens, recorded, dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, but it held. The only crisis came when the ventilation flue choked with hoarfrost, and Arne had to belly crawl onto the roof in the blizzard, tethered by a rope, to clear it with a hot poker. He was maintaining his system. Elias Thorne could only watch his system fail. When the cold finally broke, the human impact of the experiment was laid bare. Elias Thorne was a broken man. He had lost 72 of his 80 head, a financial loss of over $2,000, effectively wiping out his entire stake. The emotional toll was worse. He walked the 20 miles to Hansen's coulee, not in anger, but in supplication. He found Hansen and Dr. Weir calmly pitching hay to a herd that looked as if it had just come through a mild autumn. Thorne, his face frost-bitten and his eyes hollow, simply looked at the steaming animals, looked at the humid cavern, and asked, "How?" Arne, a man of few words, simply pointed to the earth walls, the thick roof, and the ventilation flue. He explained the principle. Do not fight the wind. Hide from it. The community, shattered by losses, some ranchers lost 100% of their stock, began to see. The news, carried by Dr. Weir, was not just that Hansen's cattle survived, but that they thrived. Hansen's wife, Marta, had been managing their own sod house, which operated on the same principle, and her cellar, a smaller jordkeller, was full of potatoes and carrots, perfectly preserved. The Hansens had not just survived. They had lived, while their neighbors, in their superior timber homes, had been in a state of siege. Dr. Silas Weir's official report to the territorial capital in Bismarck was a sensation. It was not a story. It was a clinical, brutal set of comparative data. Report on Livestock Survivability and Shelter Efficiency, Pembina County. It listed Thorne's structure. Timber frame, single plank wall, 60 s 40 feet. Cost, $450. Herd loss, 90%. It listed Hansen's. Subterranean earth-banked shelter, 80 24 feet. Cost, $40. Herd loss, 0%. The report detailed the fuel consumption, the feed consumption, and the internal temperature variances. It was an indictment of conventional wisdom. The report was reprinted in agricultural journals across the West. By the spring of 1887, the railroad land offices, desperate to stop the tide of failed and suing homesteaders, stopped distributing plans for Pennsylvania barns. They began distributing new pamphlets, heavily based on Weir's report and Hansen's design, titled The Dakota Banked Barn, a Guide to Prairie-Proof Shelters. Elias Thorne, the skeptic, became the chief convert. He spent the summer of 1887 not rebuilding his monument, but hiring Arne Hansen to supervise his crew in excavating a 300-foot-long, 30-foot-wide cattle cave on his own property. Driving through that corner of North Dakota 5 years later, the landscape was visibly changed. The few remaining tall wooden barns stood like skeletal warnings, many of them abandoned or used only for hay storage. The new sign of a prosperous, intelligent rancher was a low green mound on a hillside, a wisp of steam from a metal chimney, and a solid stone face pointing south. Arne Hansen's gopher hole had become the Dakota standard. He never sought credit, and never patented the design, which he considered to be as old as the mountains he came from. The legacy was not the cave itself, but the revolution in thinking it represented. The pioneers of the prairie had learned, at a terrible cost, that the environment would not bend to their traditions. Success did not belong to the man who built the biggest barn, but to the man who understood the laws of heat transfer. The great lesson of the frontier was one of thermal humility. True shelter was not about keeping the cold out, but about mastering the art of holding the warmth in.